Hello, M&A scientists. Welcome to the M&A Science Podcast. This podcast is part of a mission to rethink how M&A is done. The old school seller-led approach, it's dead. Buyer-led M&A is all about strategy, alignment, and efficiency, putting value creation at the center of every deal. And let's be real, it's not just about closing the deal, it's about making it successful. We uncover what truly works in M&A by learning directly from the best. If you're ready to challenge the status quo, ditch outdated methods, and learn how to minimize risk while maximizing value, you're in the right place. For episodes, resources, tools to elevate your M&A game, visit mascience.com. Follow us on LinkedIn. I'm your host, Kisan Patel, founder and CEO of Deal Room and chief scientist at M&A Science. Joining me today is Matt Pearson, senior vice president of corporate development at QuickBase. QuickBase is a low-code platform that allows businesses to create custom applications and workflows. QuickBase empowers organizations to connect their people, data, and workflows through a user-friendly platform made for those without coding or development experience in mind. Today, we're going to talk about structuring buyer-led M&A processes, avoiding common pitfalls like over-rationalizing deals, and balancing stakeholder priorities to ensure strategic alignment and long-term success. Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks for making it happen. We are live in person in Boston.
Yeah, my hometown.
At the Deal Room office. Brand new Deal Room office.
New, beautiful new office.
But thank you. And first podcast we're recording at this office.
I'm honored.
So yeah, hopefully we don't run into too many kinks and hiccups here. But we're used to doing this. Can we kick things off a little bit about your background?
Yeah, let's do it. My background's a little bit different than most. I kind of have a three-leg stool, so to speak, when it comes to corporate development. I actually started in executive management and business management in the sports industry, and I spent a good decade plus running and flipping sports franchises all over the country. And all of those lessons around how to operate and build a company parlayed well when I finally, grow up and went back to business school and became an investment banker, helped me really understand how to go from creating value to capturing it in the M&A process. And the sell side was really interesting. I was a middle market investment banker for a couple of years until I started missing how to grow and build companies again and flip myself to, I guess, a perfect wedge in the middle, which is corporate development. And it's a combination of strategy and acquisitions that helps build and grow companies. So it's a great home for me long term.
That's like the journey. So you really had front end, hands-on operational experience, moved to the investment banking side, see how the deals and value gets realized. Now you're back in between it all, which is corporate development, which is seeing things through and making sure deals are creative.
Yeah, so I've had to own a P&L. It's when you think of synergies you have to create in a buyer-led process. I've been there alongside my partners owning that P&L. I understand the operational integration components can help me with understanding the pitfalls that maybe you overestimate, and we'll talk about that when it comes to over-rationalizing a deal. I've had to work through all that myself personally as an operator, so it really aids my ability to assess an acquisition.
Hey, and a real quick on QuickBase too. That's kind of interesting history because as far as I know, that was actually a carve out of Intuit.
It was.
And then it later got acquired by a big PE firm.
Vista. Yep. Well, we had a couple different PE owners, but Vista's our current private equity partner.
Okay. So it went through a few different hands and now it's currently backed by Vista.
That's right.
Let's talk about buyer-led M&A. Let's define it. And I'd love to hear your views on your experience and how it's evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I love the term buyer-led M&A because I really do think it's different, but it's also, in my view, the way to approach corporate development for PE-backed portcos or just any strategic that's looking to do acquisitions. The reason for that is I'm a firm believer in programmatic, which is the kind of cadence, sequential acquisition of a few different targets a year. Every research point will tell you that companies that do this have a tendency to grow faster, to pivot to the market better, they withstand competitive pressures, but you got to do 2 or 3 a year. And in order to do that, you kind of have to move fast. And that means you can't wait on incoming seller-led M&A opportunities. You have to define what you're looking for and then go after that. And that's a buyer-led approach in order to succeed in that methodology. So I really think that what you're starting to kind of prioritize is buyer-led mantra is actually statistically backed up as improved performance for people who actually adhere to it.
So first and foremost, just being proactive about how you source deals. And because you're proactive, you control your pipeline.
Yep.
And that allows you to do programmatic M&A where you're doing multiple deals a year.
If you're working across side strategy, your product team, sales and marketing, you're probably looking at a capability driven approach, which then allows you to focus on the key attributes in that target that you need to acquire. And that will help you kind of whittle down and kind of cut the fat from the stuff that comes across your desk that just isn't going to fit. And you really only focus on the things that you need. And that's going to help you really speed. So it's a lot of people say M&A is a volume game, but I've always countered that by saying it's not. It's a volume game when it's focused on the right arena, the capabilities that you're looking to acquire, the problem you're trying to solve for.
So the clearer your criteria is, then that's going to allow you to just quickly assess what's a fit versus not.
Yeah, you have to have a box of preference. One of the things you want to talk to me about is how to create that view and how to get all the stakeholders aligned. But that box of preference is a mix of qualitative and quantitative metrics. And that will align to the capabilities that you need. And those attributes become things that you go search for when you're actually running a pipeline. And it really helps you speed to the right target.
When you say like there's this assessment of quantitative versus qualitative, can you like break that down to like what that actually means? If let's say you're like looking at a deal together, like how would you kind of break that down into specifics?
Sure. Well, the box of preference, I like to think about this square you want to play in. It's something that you should actually do. It's like the first thing that I did when I got to QuickBase was work around these qualitative and quantitative metrics, and actually worked with Vista and with our board and with our executive team to kind of actually write down the min and max thresholds we had for about 20 attributes. And they're a mix of qualitative and quantitative metrics. Some of them are things you would expect, like growth rates and more operating margin and retention metrics. And other things are more off the cuff, like what our view of management's strength might be, or strategic fit, or proprietary IP and patents and things like that. What it does is it gives you the chance to then frame what good looks like, so that when something comes in, you can know if it's in or out of the box. Now, it's not binary. We're not going to just walk away from something that doesn't fit that box of preference. But what it does do is it tells us if we like, for example, the big capability, the core thing that we're going after, that tech proficiency, and maybe it's behind on retention metrics or its growth rate hasn't been that great. That immediately helps us identify that which we need to believe in diligence. We automatically focus our diligence around those things. And we already know that we have buy-in from all of our stakeholders that, hey, this is what good looks like. We know this is below par. Here's our path to remediating that in integration. And we also understand why it happened, maybe why it's not where it should be. And that's going to help us get deal approvals moving faster because we're already going to attack the things that we know all of our stakeholders care about.
Can you teach this to me in like a little, and you don't have to use your company exact. I don't want to put your playbook in public. Sure. What I want to understand is, I think there's two parts. I think I'm still wrapping my head around market mapping.
Sure.
Because a lot of the stuff I'm learning that we talk about here on this podcast is easier said than done. I'm learning that the hard way. And so I kind of want to get a better sense of like, how do you sort of mature that? Because I feel like at an early stage, I'm very obvious about what the market map entails, which is like, hey, these are businesses I'm really familiar with. So there's a little bit of I'm curious of how do you sort of see that evolve? You mentioned the conversation of the PE firm. Are they kind of helping sort of shape what market map looks like? And just here's kind of, your company strategy and how you're building an M&A strategy against it. Let's start there. Sure. And then I kind of like click into the actual criterias because I got more questions around that.
Yeah. So if you go back and look at, again, programmatic M&A and that buyer-led focus, we're focused on capabilities. But one of the first things that I did when I started QuickBase was took a step back, walk through with product, with our corp dev is obviously part of a strategy function. It's not just the execution mechanism. I always like to say that M&A is the execution of that strategy. So we work on the strategy and build kind of a view for where the business is going to be in the next few years. And that's something that we work through with Vista and our board too. They want to understand where we're pointing the spear and where we looked at certain attributes. So even though we're a low-code, no-code app builder, we're focused around operational workflows. We need to attach resources to those workflows. So people management, asset management, and communicating with those people. Those are things we didn't do as well as we wanted to. And it was identified through some work streams early on with our product team. And we had market surveys and all kind of research that would support that there was demand for those kind of attributes. So those are the capabilities that I'm talking about. You get those high-level capabilities and say, okay, resource management is something that we need to focus on. What's more important, people or assets? People. Okay, let's work on people. Now let's get really granular as to what people management means. We have different verticals we serve. We have different ICPs. Let's get commonalities across those functions and work to define all the different capabilities and the metrics that matter and don't. Those become the keywords for your organic search. So we can then, if something comes in and it's a low-code operator in Europe, well, we're not looking there because we don't want to open up our overseas at the moment. We only want to look at something in resource management that can solve for these problems. So that's how you kind of take this universe of options and really cut ourselves down to just the things that matter. And then within people management, there's all these different attributes. We wanted to focus on certain ones. And so we decided to only look at companies that did those things. And then with the scorecard, we kind of looked at growth rates and, what do we think good looks like from a margin perspective, retention metrics, all that kind of stuff. And it allowed us to hone in on size, and it allowed us to hone in on companies that did or didn't fit into the business so that we could further whittle down the universe into kind of a core targets we want to go after. And it really made the process a lot easier in helping us define that which was good. And so once you kind of know the capability works, and that's your first stress test. Let's get it in front of the SMEs. Let's get it in front of the tech department. Does this capability solve for that need? That's first pass. Second pass is all the scorecard metrics around its operating and financial profile. You can rank and look at that. And then you already know what you have to diligence and prove out. And that becomes your bid approval deck. Hey, here's this business. Here's why it's already a strategic fit. Here's why it's worth what it's worth based on its profiles. And here's our preliminary integration plan to address to why it's going to help us from positives and from the negatives perspective, what we're going to do. And you have the whole plan before you've even bought the company.
I can't tell if you're making this interview easier or harder because we're going to keep along the same track.
Yeah,
so you got the investment thesis,
Yeah.
right? Because it is based pretty much on capabilities, and
Right.
it could be different, right? It could be geographical expansion, and that would make sense to go look at the company in Europe
right.
because that's part of our plan.
Yep.
Or maybe it's just purely the talent, and we're trying to do an acqui-hire because we just need some kind of AI engineering. And then, but like this one makes a lot of sense. Capabilities is pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
You've identified ICPs where either you're planning to build that capability, or if you can somehow acquire it, it's going to be something that would be synergistic to sell into the same ICPs. Does that sound about right?
That's right.
And then, and this is where I'm going to get your take on this. It's almost like your order of diligence here. There's obviously, here's this clear strategic fit part of it. And then when you look at it, I feel like coming up through finance, you tend to look at the numbers because I think there's a clarity around what are the revenues. People want to know. Fundamentally, it's what a lot of this is going to be based around. But then how strong is that revenue? What's the retention look like? What's the growth look like? What's the footprint and size of the company? Is that kind of the starting place? And where do you go from there? Like what's the order? Because
Yeah, it really is. It's the operating metrics and it's the financial metrics.
okay,
And those things become things that in a buyer-led process, we're going to push for earlier, where in a seller-led process, maybe they wouldn't give you the benefit of time or the access saying, hey, let's get to an IOI first or an LOI before you get to that data. In a buyer-led process, we're going to push to get some of those things answered earlier to make sure that we have more what I would call like certainty around what we call true operating characteristics. So the company is what it says it is. And we would do that earlier in the process than maybe a seller process.
I think this is a good time to break down for the record.
Yeah.
Seller-led versus buyer-led,
Sure.
seller-led / banker-led
Banker-led, yeah.
versus buyer-led.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the seller-led process, I think, which is, I'm sure you've talked to on other podcasts, is obviously the banker-led process where they've reached out with a prepackaged SIM, introductory materials. You get access to the management team for a short period of time. And there's kind of a rigor around the communication, a limit on the data flow and the access to that team. And then you have to make a decision around value and whether or not you think it's an acquisition that you want to pursue. Because that is structured, you sometimes don't always get the chance to get all of the information you might want as a buyer, which probably we have different key criteria than everyone else. We may not get that culture fit. We may not understand some of the operating metrics that we want to, and the tech proficiency, which is really the key thing we're looking at, is that capability, right? That key tech proficiency. You're going to sometimes miss that. And so unless you really know the business and it's an aha, because bankers like to get the kind of the public logo and the brand equity behind the deals that they do. you may miss a really great tech proficiency play that's a B- or a C+ from an operating metrics perspective, but actually might be the right target for you to acquire because the tech's better than maybe the A+ one.
This episode is sponsored by DealRoom, the only M&A platform designed for buyer-led M&A. Most M&A tools were built for sellers or bankers, but if you're in corporate development, doing 2 or more deals a year, you need something built for how you work. DealRoom is purpose-built for the buy side. From pipeline through diligence, it gives you centralized control over every deal, clear visibility into tasks, timelines, and ownership, and reduces manual work with bulk updates and templated rooms, and that's buyer-led M&A. Whether you're looking to speed up diligence, keep integration on track, or just cut down on chaotic email threads, DealRoom gives you the structure to scale. Go to dealroom.net or hit the link in the episode description and check it out. Here's to the deal. In a banker-led process, it's prepackaged, which I think there's some pluses with that. Like
There
stuff
is.
like ready to initially, like first phase of reviewing numbers, it's put together pretty nicely.
It's put together beautifully, and you can make an assessment on what you get. And the key part about it is,
Don't bet too hard on the forecast.
well, yeah, never bet on the forecast. But for the most part, the legacy data is validated, right? They do a lot of work to make sure that the information they get is correct, it's consistent, it's accurate. So yeah, you're going to have a little more faith maybe in the accuracy of the data. But again, I would offset that with a buyer-led process where maybe you have some reservation around the quality of data you get from founders, which maybe isn't as well kept. You have the time to go back and gut check that and run the math and validate on your own accord. So you get, it's a pro and con to each one.
There's limit on data and the team.
There's definitely a limit on team for sure in a seller-led process. And I think culture is a huge part of what makes a deal work and what makes a deal fail potentially. And getting involved with not just the CEO or the founder, but the rest of the management team is harder in a seller-led process.
These things like interconnect, because when you talk about the limitation on the flow of data, the team, but then also lends to limitation of team, means limitation on identifying the culture fit. And then you just got some general time constraints, which you mentioned like the tech proficiency, and you're basically shortcutting your diligence, it sounds like.
Yeah, you have to make more assumptions in a seller-led process.
More assumptions. Okay.
And at least at the front end of the process, and I think that's the harder part about it, where I would actually argue in a buyer-led process, when we get to an LOI, we probably have a lot more certainty in our ability to close that deal. In a seller-led process, I have less certainty, and I rely heavily on the actual post-LOI diligence to make sure we've got it right. And I'd argue that's probably where seller-led processes have a higher tendency to fail or have a retrade because they've forced so many assumptions on the front end of that process, where you don't have to do that in a buyer-led process. You have the benefit of being able to gut check before you get to LOI.
So the buyer-led process, you get more control. You obviously got more time because you're working directly with the target onto a deal that's pretty amicable.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more about the culture fit. Like, what are you actually doing to identify culture fit? I don't mean play too hard devil's advocate, but the thing I've realized is you don't have access to many people, pre-LOI.
Nope.
Like you got maybe on one hand, you can count how many people you're really going to be interfacing with. And I struggle with there's things you could do to understand culture. You can kind of like feel the ecosystem and figure things out because everybody's got a reputation, organization, individuals. But yeah, I'd love to get your take of like, how do you find culture fit?
Culture is a great, I'm first off, separate from M&A, culture and organizational culture is something that I actually care strongly about and, have a whole entire thesis around what culture is. To me, it's actually an intentional construct. It's not amorphous. A lot of people think it's the ping pong table and let it, bring your pet to work. But to me, culture is the actual output of a system of processes and procedures, and you can quantify it. And I actually work with HR on a lot of these things to walk through elements of what we consider culture to be, which is a combination of how people are your identity, how people are instructor or coached, the nature of their intercommunication, which is often what people think culture is, which is that ping pong table and, happy hours and stuff like that. And then feedback. And so, feedback is review systems and things like that. So when we look at culture, even though we may, in a buyer or seller-led process, only have access to 5, 6, 7 people, I think you do get the benefit in a buyer-led process of more time in person, And you don't have the banker sitting next to you the entire time, so it's a little bit more of a free conversation. And you get the time in a meeting. We have one coming up. I'm headed to California tomorrow for a company that we're looking at, where we have one-on-one set up with the key management team just to talk to them, and also a session around HR and benefits that digs into the staff to a degree that we probably wouldn't get access to in a seller-led process, where we're walking through major discussions around roles and responsibilities, how they go to work, what they do when they're at work. So we're breaking down culture into systems, into processes and procedures that you can discuss and define along the way. I think a healthy exercise for every company as a buy side is to actually write down and define their own view of what culture is, who they are. And a lot of companies don't have a great view of what their own culture is. They might individually think they know, but there's definitely a difference in perception of what management thinks their company is and what the rest of the company, the employees, think. And being able to harmonize around a company view as who we are, and then taking that and saying, okay, is this acquired entity like that? And it sounds obvious. You wouldn't want to be, if I like working in an office in a suit, you don't want to buy a company that has people in jeans and beanbags in the hall. That's never going to work. And I know that's a high level example, but if you start to break down culture into its component parts and systems and processes, you're going to be able to tell relatively quickly whether or not you have things you need to work through. I'm not saying you shouldn't buy the company, but I have definitely been, when I was a banker, in rooms where companies that were all in office and we were representing a 100% remote business, and they didn't buy the company on that basis because they knew there was going to be an issue with having full remote staff of a material degree interacting with people who are only in offices. So it does factor.
We're making a very hypothetical situation that I may or may not have encountered, but on a deal, you clearly see that there's going to be cultural challenges.
Yep.
With a specific department, right? Let's say tech company, sales and marketing, great, not a big deal. That part's fine. But the engineering, it's like, whoa, there's like very different cultures of that. And your engineering leads brought that up. Now you sort of know that, but then there's this general business case of why we're trying to do this deal. There's, geographic expansion at play and cross-sell opportunities. I guess part of me goes to the value of the deal itself, like where you feel like generally this is going to be a good deal that we're getting. It'd be different if it's something that we're really spending a premium on to get the deal done, versus here it's like, there's like more room for it. How do you like cross those things when you put all these things together? I guess this goes to like,
if culture's going to be such a factor where you walk away or you don't do the deal.
Yeah, well, I almost think it's like it's competing with other elements of the criteria, and I don't think it's like it's basically this is a minus, this is a minus, and you're out. I almost feel like it's pluses and minus, where you say, hey, you know what? There's a price for everything at the end of the day. That hey, this could be the total bag with a lot of these culture issues, but we're getting such a good deal on it. Like maybe we roll our sleeves up and fix it.
I think it comes down to the pluses and minuses all factor as to what I call true operating characteristics, and then we put those on paper in the form of synergies, and they're on the bottom line and the top line. And when you get into culture differences, you have to step back and look at whether or not you actually can achieve said assumptions in light of the aforementioned dispute. So if the degree of culture delta is going to affect your ability to integrate the business properly or to achieve scale and achieve the synergies you put on paper, I think that's when you start to look at whether or not you should do the deal.
Then it's almost like you calculate those dis-synergies.
You got 100%. Yeah, definitely. And there are times where I've been part of transactions where we actually went through adjustments to how we did integration and who came forward in the transaction based on the belief of whether or not they were going to factor in the growth of the business. I think dis-synergies are something that people don't often put in as much attention to in a transaction.
I think that's what I need to do. I need to like model that out and say, hey, here's all the things that look good, but then I'll take it. So at least you got a voice on the table. I'm listening to my head of engineering and saying, yep, we're going to calculate that as dis-synergies, knowing that, like, let's be a little objective here. Like, what do we value that dis-synergies as? The view how to deal with it, like how much impact should that do on the way we value this deal? Then I think it's good.
Yeah.
Versus like now I'm kind of ignoring him just to get the deal done.
That goes back to that over-rationalizing the deal. I think there's so many times people get so entrenched and so excited about, hey, this is going to be great. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. And they kind of poo-poo and put this stuff to the side. And I see it all the time from the different places that I've been involved in M&A, whether it was a banker or in corp dev, where it's, well, our go-to-market function is better. We'll get past that. We can fix their sales. It's like, well, is it a bad product? Can you fix it? There's some major assumptions you've made there around our ability to affect scale. Do they have good salespeople? Because we need them to cross-train us as much as we're going to cross-train them. If we don't think their sales team's that great, how well is that cross-selling synergy going to be? It's a major factor. I probably am more conservative than most when it comes to revenue synergies.
I get a badge for every deal I get done. You know that? So that's why
you probably push to get the cross.
I push to get the deal. I got to get the badge, just like in scouts. You got to get your badges.
There's so much more risk on the buy side, I think, where we really have to put our name to it.
I tell you, trying to set up the first deal for this company, so hard. Like I've advised on well over 30 companies, but there's nothing in place. Like nothing, just the whole process of evaluating. And just like what we're talking about, like now I got to go back and say, hey, let's start factoring in dis-synergies. And then at least I feel like we'd get towards a common view with the leadership team of evaluating these opportunities.
Yeah, I think you have to have a fair and rational assessment. And that's probably the hardest part at times, especially I think with M&A too, especially on the buy side. A factor that people don't consider as much is everyone always talks about the target. But sometimes the biggest change is actually in the acquiring entity, in that home entity. What does it mean for me is just as applicable to the colleagues that I work with, that I have to collaborate with to convince that this is a good idea. And we have stakeholders in sales and product and engineering and marketing that all of a sudden start going, well, wait a second, we're bringing in an AI team. What does that mean for me? We're bringing in a new widget. Is my widget now not as important as the one we just acquired? All those things factor where you end up getting biased, at least you can have biased opinions around synergies, both cost and revenue, that can impact your ability to do a deal. And so making sure your stakeholders are aligned and believe that we're trying not just to push a deal through for the sake of doing a deal, but really trying to build the company the right way and assessing dis-synergies as much as we have possibilities. That's how you get trust and you get those people to get the deal done.
How do you do that?
Communication.
A lot of communication
and listening. And I find I actually don't do, could I run the whole entire deal myself? Sure. I think anyone in this role could probably do a deal themselves and put synergies on paper and make assumptions. What I've found is I actually do less. And by that, I mean, I actually make my stakeholders part of the process, part of the decisioning, and they're the ones who are putting the numbers on paper with support and guidance from Corp Dev, so that they own it. And when you own something and your own numbers on it, and we're all part of that discussion, I think there's a little more comfort as opposed to me walking and saying, hey, you're expected to do X and Y and Z and synergies. It's a little bit of a different approach. And I think there's a more trust then that comes from that process.
How do you balance like getting the right stakeholders in too? Because I feel like it goes to the same thing. When you're looking at these deals early, you don't want to distract people. And then it's the same thing. If you're trying to get alignment with all these stakeholders, then you're trying to do the opposite. You're trying to like rein them all in and get their opinions and make them feel part of this.
Yep.
How do you strike the right balance? Like who do you usually bring in? Is it,
It's tough. It's tough because everyone says they want to do M&A and then no one has time for it because they always have organic things to work on. What I've done is identified teams and I break them into small groups by product or by attribute or what, the job to be done that we're trying to solve for. So we have an AI team. And there's just a couple of people who are just assigned to that, and they only look at things that are related to AI. And then we have for different products and capabilities, we have people who look at those things, and they know that around 20, 30% of their job is to be spent on early stage assessment of M&A. And so their work schedule has allowed for that ebb and flow, and everyone else is supportive of it. One of the first things they did was went around and said to all of our function leads, okay, finance, I need one or two people here. Tax, I need one person there. And I went across and we identified those people. And then I've been training them along the way in group sections and in function specific sections around what to do and how. And I always say that part of my role is just to make this lift for them as easy as possible. That's actually why we have Deal Room, because we got everyone set up and trained on how to do diligence lists and how to do integration lists. And even though we haven't worked through a deal yet because I'm relatively new at QuickBase, every single stakeholder at QuickBase has already opined on the integration checklist and on the diligence checklist, and they already know how to use Deal Room. So when we have a deal coming in, they don't need me anymore. They can actually just go do on their own, and then we'll adjust to the minutia that pops up along the way. But 80% of the work's already done, and that just frees up everyone's time. So I just pre-trained everybody, and then it also selected a few people so that they knew that was part of their job, as opposed to randomly pulling people in.
What is this deal room? I never heard of it.
Yeah. Oh, it's a
Just
great tool.
Kidding.
Yeah, it's
All
a great
right.
tool.
We'll put a disclaimer. We're not trying to turn this into a big commercial, but since typically the best acquirers in the industry are using Deal Room, we can go ahead and get a little bit of the perspective, because I do think it's the part around execution, right? We talked a lot about here shaping the strategy, being proactive on the deals, and now we're talking about aligning the stakeholders. You brought in the technology piece for both diligence and integration, and I wanted to get an understanding, because I mean, right now I'm just using our own product to build a pipeline, and I've done up to LOI, which is kind of fun. You're starting to, just even the small list, you're still getting back and forth comments and stuff. But I'm curious about, you have a much bigger team on this. How are you aligning them or using the platform to sort of align them? Is it more of just, here's the steps of the process that we are now standardizing for doing diligence integration? I'm just
I live by the 80-20 rule. I basically standardized 80% of the acquisition process. And so I got alignment on, again, those big strategic pillars, those capabilities we're going to go after. So everyone knows that what we're looking at is on strategy. It's not a wild card. And then I work to understand the pros and cons and the granularity of those pillars so that everyone knows the attributes that really will drive impact and show accretion, as opposed to, I don't know if we need this, which is usually where things get caught on the buy side, when people say, well, we could build this internally. And QuickBase is a home of app builders, so everyone thinks they can build stuff. We have to do more work around saying, well, maybe we should look at this from an acquisition perspective instead. And we already got that alignment before we even started doing pipeline. So when stuff does come in, they already know that this is on strategy and it's a uplift in capability. And that's true for not just my colleagues at QuickBase, but for private equity, for the board. They know what we're looking at and why. So you're building in pre-approval along the way. And when it comes to the diligence process and preliminary diligence, we did training sessions with all those identified stakeholders to know what to look for, and brought them in early so that they're actually the key. It's not me. Again, I say I do very little. I just move pieces around. The people who opine as to whether or not it's a good deal or not are our subject matter experts. It has to pass their muster first. They've got to believe this is the right tech, that this is the right solution, that they can sell it. So we do a demo. We get through the NDA process, which is kind of my first criteria when we look at companies, and I will decide whether or not, based on that conversation, this gets past NDA and into demo. And when we have demos, that it's only an hour, and that's usually enough, because most of the people we work with are really skilled and qualified. They kind of will know relatively quickly if there's a there. And so all I've done is maybe obligated my team by capability focus to an hour of time.
So standardize about 80% of it. That's where the tech stack can be helpful.
Yep.
Create continuity between just your deal stages, and also help with alignment, because there's report outs that you can do, board members and so forth, and just have general collaboration between your different departments.
Yep.
Going back to the process itself. So you get an NDA signed, and then you will do a demo of the product.
Yep.
Is it solely their demo, or are you demoing some of your stuff too? Or is it,
It's usually their demo with maybe a little bit of time about us, just to help them understand the why, right? If you have that dual symbiotic synergy, hey, wait a second, guys, you don't have a CRM and an ERP. We can be that repository. You have this data field. There's ways in which we already know, because we've done that capabilities assessment, how we can help the target and how the target can help us. And usually that approach, I think, goes a long way, especially with founder-led businesses, for them to understanding why you reached out, as opposed to just having a generic, smile and dial call.
And then you do the demo, then you can, this looks good, there's interest, we want to move to preliminary diligence requests.
Right. We send over we standardize that request list. We ask for some base level of information. We already know from talking to all of our stakeholders the key things they're going to look for an offer approval. And we get that information. We might have another couple of meetings around finance, like everyone has to, and we dig in a little bit on tech and on staffing, and we make some assumptions internally. We'll walk through a synergies model with our stakeholders, select stakeholders, and that's relatively quick process once you standardize it to get to where you want to be from an approval process to get an offer out the door.
And then once you get the approval, you'll get the offer in front. How do you approach negotiations? Because I part of me is like, do you really dig in and get a sense of what are their expectations? To me, I feel like the golden rule of negotiations: don't put the first offer.
Yeah, it's true. He who speaks first loses, right? Usually, I don't want to give all away my trade secrets here, but usually we kind of get into ourselves what I call, again, that box of preference. The deal process, that negotiation process, as you know, like the IOI versus LOI kind of helps you either way. Sometimes when I talk to people and say, hey, what does a perfect outcome look for you? Sometimes, first off, no one's ever given me a low number of what they're worth. If I had $1 for every $100 million company, I'd be 100 millionaire, is my common joke. Like everyone thinks they're worth $100 million. But for the most part, when you know you have a real conversation to be had, is when someone doesn't throw out 100 million at you, is when they throw out a real number. And when they throw out a range, that's real. You can kind of tell. And I think for people who've been around M&A long enough, we all know the kind of where the market moves and the bell curve that exists for companies in their industry. And so when we kind of talk very vaguely about what does a good outcome look for you, and the other side throws out a range that's reasonable, then we know we have something that we could work on. And then we let the natural IOI versus LOI process kind of help us whittle into a range of agreement.
And that's pretty straightforward. You're right. There's general multipliers people look at. I still find some bid-ask spread challenges.
Oh, it's terrible. It still exists. The COVID hangover has not gone away.
It is, because they'll still see stuff in the news, and then you got to break it down. It's like, listen, like that company's at a 50% year-over-year growth. You're zero.
Yeah.
Like let's put that into perspective. Yeah. They're making money. You're losing money.
Right.
There's, the revenue model is completely different. Their ARR, you're transactional. Like let's put all those factors together, and you're nowhere close to what they're getting.
Yeah. Well, I think what makes this negotiation easy, going back to that box of preference, that creation of a programmatic approach, I kind of already know from working with our board, with our PE partner, that how we're going to allocate funds and what we want to do with each deal. And so that does put a valuation limit on what we're going to approach. Not because we couldn't do something that's different, but because we don't want to.
You're being pragmatic about it.
Being pragmatic about it. And so, exactly. And so when we do get someone in the air of rationality, it's really easy then to kind of say no and say, listen, this is where we need to be. This is kind of what we're looking at for market. And that helps us kind of whittle down, the prospects a little bit. If we know, if that said, and I think people who've been around M&A know enough, to know when someone's throwing a highball at you, but really doesn't mean it, and is just waiting to see what you say. And we kind of take a different approach. And that just happened to me on a transaction, in which we had a material bid-ask spread. And we just let the negotiation process and the IOI process get ourselves into a zone of reason. Partly because I kind of felt like, I don't think that's a real number. I think you're just saying 100 million for the sake of 100 million. And so we got ourselves down there. So sometimes you got to throw out something on paper as a buyer to get them into believing that you've got a real number.
Okay, so we know the supply-demand curve, right?
Yep.
In my head, as you describe this, I'm thinking like there's a rationalized value curve, and then there's a relationship curve.
Yep.
Is that true? Like and what I wanted to understand is like, how does that relation development fit into this? That
it's a huge factor. Money is not the only driving factor. I know that sounds, as a capitalist, someone who believes in supply and demands, and bankers would probably disagree on that one too. But I've definitely found that if you're known as a good home, if they like who they've met along the way in that process, not just me, but all the other people that they meet along the way, and that's what the buyer-led process gets you, is that more of that individual interaction that's not maybe overseen by a banker. You build that trust factor. You want to be known as a good home. That is just so valuable, because founders and CEOs really do generally care about their employees, and they don't want to have them sent somewhere where they're going to have a bad experience where their reputation is stained. And so if you can really prove that you are a great place to work and a great home for the acquired entity's employees, that is going to chip away at most bid-ask spread, unless it's just a bridge too far.
Like how much? Like a turn?
It could be a turn. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it can be that meaningful. You can see $20, $30, $40 million spreads come way down. I
guess maybe if we had to put a perspective with maybe percentage.
Yeah, it's percentage is probably better than a turn. It just depends on the EBITDA. But yeah, it can have a meaningful impact on your ability.
Maybe like 10, 20%, something like that. Or are you thinking even 20, 30%?
I'll give you a frame of reference on some stuff in the last 6 to 9 months I've worked on where we've been able to negotiate down. And yeah, it was probably 20, 30% where we were able to get to come down off of their ask.
total ass. It wasn't, hey, I'm just going to throw you in a crazy earnout and let you go work for it.
No, and I think deal structure cures all wounds. Everyone has hesitation around earnouts. There are definitely times that I've been part of those and they've been wonderful, but they're also just more complicated from an integration perspective. I think everyone loves that, all cash or combo equity kind of deal where it's a clean slate. You don't have to worry about that hanging chad. But for the most part, not having to worry, being viewed as a good home, having the relationship that the buyer-led process allows you to build, it's gonna get you from 10 to 20, maybe even more off a bid-ask spread problem.
All right, gotta spend more time hanging out.
Yeah,
build relationships.
A couple drinks at the bar.
You got any hacks? I think that's what I was thinking. Was I got the one deal now where I just know there's an advisor in between, and I'm like, I gotta go have a beer with them. Like, it's just bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the advisor's going to do their job and they're going to fight for every dollar. But at the end of the day, they work for the founder, the CEO.
They are. And I'm like, look, you got to give me more confidence in this deal. And I'm not going to have confidence unless I get trust with the seller. And you need to not stand in the way of building that relationship.
Right.
So we'll have to see how that goes, because they do kind of revert to put themselves right in the middle and disconnect the direct communication, which I don't like.
No, it's true.
Then it goes back to the other deal, which I got the proprietary deal, which is great. I like the seller. We got a great relationship, but expectations are not there.
Well, it also matters because going back to that box of preference, when you are looking at metrics that are below threshold, and again, it's not binary. You're not saying no. You're just looking at, okay, what do I need to believe to then right-size that problem or understand why it occurred? And in a seller-led process, sometimes you don't get the benefit of that understanding. And in a buyer-led process where you can have more relaxed conversation is probably the best way to put that, because it's not overseen by the banker. Then you can really get to the bottom of the truth, usually around what happened and why. And it's not some made up story or sugar-coated, anecdote about what happened with X, Y, and Z. You get to the truth. And that, again, builds that rapport, builds that trust, that builds a relationship that allows you to be viewed as a good home.
I agree, because there's no reason to have the lipstick or sugarcoat. And then it just makes it, then you have like the real trust. And when you have the trust, you'll work through issues. Issues come up, you have a working relationship. I feel like that's the thing I struggle with. I don't know.
Trust is key. And I think the buyer-led process will help with that trust. It helps you understand your synergies. It helps you understand maybe the historical operating path of that business. It just aids confidence in deal certainty. And you heard me say earlier, I have more confidence in a buyer-led process at LOI stage into closing a deal than I would on a sell-side process. And again, it's because there's just more trust that's been able to be built in that conversation.
When we talk about putting an offer together, there's that component of financial risk. I don't know if you come across like debt covenants or over leveraging in a competitive, high pressure environment. Do those happen at all? Because is it just what I'm looking at right now, where I'm like, private credit's expensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing I think people don't think about is when you put together a synergies plan and there's debt raised against that synergies plan. If that falls apart, you've put your home entity, where I work, I've put them at risk. And that's something that I think about, because we don't want to damage the business in the light of just doing a transaction for transaction's sake. The true operating characteristics that I talk about, what do we reasonably believe we can achieve, is the goal that I always strive to. And along the way, people have said to me, well, Matt, what's the number that I need to get to? And I answer back, there is no target you're trying to get to. Because we're not trying to solve for the valuation or the ROI. We're trying to get to what we really think we can achieve with this integration. So I often do a lot of the work with synergies with colleagues effectively blind. And by that, I mean they don't really understand what the impact of what they're putting on paper is, because I don't want them to know. And then we'll determine whether or not we can actually do the deal after that. But they need to have like an open, honest approach.
The right way to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people just want to do the deal, right?
Yeah, that's why we reverse engineer it. Like, this is what's going to get the right debt ratio, so what's going to get approved. And
I might be a unicorn then in the industry. I don't do that because I just don't believe I can do a lot of damage. There's no reason to do a deal just for doing a deal. Anyone can put that stuff on paper. And here's the big part about it. You lose trust. I would lose trust. I would lose faith with my stakeholders if I just overestimated everything and forced them into stuff they don't believe in, because then they have to own that plan and they have to own the revenue. So if you look back at all those salespeople who have to then drive those synergies, and if it's impossible to hit, I've now impacted their ability to feed their family, to take home commissions, to take home bonuses. Like, that's something I really think about. If we can't affect the cost synergies the right way, and we end up hurting our own profile, and then our own performance drops. I've now impacted my colleagues. That's something I think about all the time.
I think that's the right thing to do. You do good deals, don't do bad deals.
Yeah.
It's hard not to do bad deals. I'm going to tell you. I'm like, I don't know if I have like the self-therapy confession here on this podcast, but in the early days, I do these interviews and I'm like, yeah, deal fever, like blah, blah, blah. But man, just like early stages of trying to build an M&A program, it's like falling prey to all this stuff that I used to joke at. And,
bad deals happen. I had one, and it was years, we had some fraud, and it was years after we did diligence, that it was uncovered. And it really hurt. And it hurt me because I take so much pride in trying to get to the heart of everything and say, hey, we did our best to diligence this one, and we missed it.
What could you have done different to like catch it?
I think I would have done more on the tech deep dive and really spent more time on the tech. Yeah.
Also, it wasn't a financial. It was the actual tech that was.
Yeah, it was actual tech. Yeah. It was a problem with the technology. And I don't know if anyone would have caught it in diligence or not. You kind of question those things sometimes when you have a deal that goes sideways. And it makes you reconsider how you approach everything. But I probably would have just been more stringent on some stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
It's okay to be tough.
You learn through experience. Like you're not going to do this at what you did before again.
No, I think sometimes as an acquirer, you're doing diligence, but sometimes you have this fear of being too tough. That goes back to that whole being a good home. So if I'm really, really a stickler on diligence, am I hurting our view? But we have a fiduciary responsibility to properly assess a business, and we've got to ask tough questions sometimes. And sometimes that fear of being known as a bad home or being too tough or being too difficult or halting a deal. Everyone's looking at the deadline. We're going to close the deal at the end of the month. And you're the guy that's got to stand up there and say, hey, here maybe we shouldn't. That can be a tough place to be sometimes.
That's another thing to strike the right balance on, because even now, like I've really pared down my initial diligence list just to keep it friendly. I'm not asking you for 100 things. I got 10 things I'm asking you for just to start us building a model and starting to talk through what a deal would look like. And that obviously expands to a bunch of more things, but that's part of it. It's kind of realizing like the NDA, like let's keep negotiations simple. Let's keep this a good experience. But you got the flip side of like, you can't be too naive on this stuff. You can't be, or I guess there's no such thing as like overly cautious. Like you should sort of dig in and look at these things. And
yep. I think going back to trust, going back to that buyer versus seller led, going back to programmatic M&A, standardizing those processes. The buyer-led process allows you to standardize. It allows you to get the big rocks uncovered. It allows you to maybe slow down to uncover the things you might miss, in a seller-led process. And so I think going back to, that debt covenants and, those problems that can pop up, getting those things right, getting all your assumptions down right. I think the buyer-led process allows you to put all the pieces up in advance that are going to matter for your company, and make sure you hit those check the box marks in a softer timeline, because the banker is going to force you into that date, right? They're going to force you. Hey, you said on your offer you'd close it by this date, and you get a little more of a relaxed process. And it's not by much. I mean, to be honest with you, I think diligence periods have dropped so much. One time I had a banker tell me they could. I should diligence the company in 4 weeks, which is a near impossibility. I don't even know if we can do financial Q of E in that period of time, to be honest with you. I don't want to run it long because everyone knows time kills deals.
Yep.
But you can probably get yourself an extra half a month, extra couple of weeks in a buyer-led process, which usually is more than enough just to calm down a little bit and give yourself that breathing room to get it right, to catch everything.
Other than the negotiations, just when things pop up, I feel like you build that working relationship, which is hard if you are running a bank process. You don't get that. It's a little bit of a dictated process.
It's a dictated process, yeah.
Not as fun to be in. But if it's truly worth it, then sure, you could win the auction. They say you're never a winner when you win an auction.
Well, it's because you've overpaid, right?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
When you say break your debt covenants, what usually triggers that? Is that just, hey, you sort of drew too much debt on the company?
Yeah, you just don't. Usually it's a combination of your revenue, your ratios are off. So you don't have like your EBITDA to debt to EBITDA ratios off, or your stuff like that. Your cash flow is off compared to what you said you'd have.
Then you get in trouble?
Then you get in trouble, yeah.
Bank comes after you?
Yeah, it could. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what? You got to work through them and...
Yeah, you don't want that.
Almost a term. Yeah.
No one wants to be in the zone of restructuring.
CFO gets bad. CFO wants to talk to you in his office.
Exactly. You said you would do this, didn't happen. What happened?
I think that's the toughest job. I thought being a CEO is the toughest job. I think being the CFO is like really the toughest job.
I think that it's because you're on the hook for future projection performance that, it's tough.
Like the literal buck stops there. Like literal.
Yeah.
You could just the CEO's like, the CFO, what are you doing?
I know it's hard. It is a hard spot to be. And CorpDev is the same place. We own that financial model with them and the underwrite of the transaction. And I think,
do you guys report up to CEO, CFO? CEO.
Yep.
Oh, okay. I've seen a lot where a lot of feedback companies there goes up to the CFO.
I think it varies. I've seen both. It depends on how you view the function and where strategy sits. I'm definitely more that CorpDev is part of the strategy function and is helping to align the future position in the business.
Is it a separate strategy group or are they combined?
Separate. I mean, I think, where I am now, strategy sits more in corporate development and alongside product, and we kind of work together and collaborate. So product and corp dev kind of work together to set that. It depends on each company structure. If the corp dev function is really more executional and really is just focused on, not even deal origination, but just transacting, it's going to probably sit in the CFO department because it's more of a finance function. If it's more origination and corporate, like actual positioning and competitive intelligence and those kind of dynamics, you're going to sit more on the CEO side. I think
that's always found interesting. It's always different, where strategy, corp dev, and integration sits. Yep. Let's talk about integration.
Sure.
Like this is the magic of deals being more successful. I've seen the industry sort of wake up and be more attuned to it. And I feel like even for us building technology, we've even are building so much more around things that attribute to early integration planning and creating continuity between diligence and integration. What have you seen work well?
Integration starts in diligence, and you have to carry the same team members who are in diligence in integration. I think one of the areas where things fall apart is if you have separate integration and diligence teams, and there's this quote unquote handoff of learnings, it just doesn't work as well. Everything that you find in diligence becomes that which you action in integration, and in order for that to work, you have to have the same people involved in the process. And so that's why I went and pre-picked all the people, because you want those leaders involved throughout the entirety. Now, you might have a varying degree of supporting staff in integration who actually has to go affect all the different tasks. And that's fine. You can have a lot more people involved in integration than in diligence, but you still need to have that continuity.
So same team members, and then you really want to have them continuing, taking all this information they pick up in diligence and turning into action in integration.
Right.
What does that team look like?
It's a function lead for every function in the company alongside subject matter experts, depending on what you're acquiring.
Okay. So I'll pick a function lead and maybe I can give them an opportunity to pick up a sidekick if they need it.
Yep.
And they say, okay, you're going to be doing diligence, but you're also going to be building the integration plan.
That's right.
Then do you have like a central integration office or anything?
No, that's me. And then the corp dev department here at QuickBase, we have a operations manager, Brittany. She's wonderful, and she helps organize a lot of that stuff.
So, but I mean, technically, there's no like formal handoff from this integration function to the business. It's sort of like just picked up by the business from the beginning.
Right.
That is an interesting. I feel like this is like an emerging new school of thought of like.
I don't. It might be. It's always what I've done.
Well, it's like the pendulum goes over, right? You didn't have an IMO. You get to the point you're running like concurrent deals. So you're like, oh, we need to have an integration function. You set up this integration function and then you're kind of see the pros and cons of it. I mean, there is like pragmatic of how you integrate companies that could have the significant value. But then there's this handoff that you sort of hand it off to this IMO, then hand it off to the business,
right?
Which creates points of friction where here you're describing having the pragmatic approach, but it's directly owned by the business from the very beginning.
Yep.
And it just continued. There is no handoff between.
There's no handoff. I think if only because sometimes what will happen is the integration team will have a different view on what matters, and they'll have their own experiences related to, well, you didn't know this, or you should have asked for this, and you didn't get it in diligence. And so you end up with the diligence team focused potentially on the wrong things, and integration focused on their things. And those two things don't connect. And so if you have two different groups, they either need to be really well coached and aligned and have everything organized in a way to make sure there is no opportunity cost to having the separation and that knowledge transfer. Why set yourself up for that risk? Have everyone on the same team. And usually what I've done, if we do need to do 2 deals at one time, you have your A list of senior people who are kind of on the bigger deals. And then if you have a smaller transaction that you're doing at the same time, what a great opportunity to up-level those people and help them manifest and become leaders and be part of that deal. And it's usually smaller, so there's less risk. And then, the corp dev team is there and they can check in with their direct report and their senior report if they need to, but then they can run that small deal themselves. Then they learn. Now you've got 2 groups of people who can do it instead of 1.
I like this. So I was going to ask you, how do you manage this with concurrent deals? Because that's where things really get crazy. But I like that you're sort of leveling up folks and giving them an opportunity to see what they're made of, basically.
You manage it through standardization and coaching. You get everybody on the same systems and the same processes. It's that 80-20 rule. You get everyone on the same stuff. And then the 20% of variability is just that deal specific minutia. The continuity would be the corporate development team making sure that we handle all of the 20% of stuff that goes awry. And everything else is roughly standardized.
So integration comprises of tons of decisions to make, and you sort of want to keep a strong pace of getting decisions and executing them. Do you supplement like steering committee, anything of this stuff, just to make sure you have a strong cadence of making those decisions?
Yeah, we meet weekly. I think
you just form that with like, hey, it's who meets weekly, I guess.
It's the leads, the function leads.
All the function leads meet
all the
weekly.
function leads in one room all at the same time, so you have cross-functional.
So you don't have to have like a third, like a setup steering committee. It's just, hey, we're there at that point.
Right.
Do we just create this, like big companies just create layers to create layers? Is that the...
Maybe. I mean, listen, I think there's definitely junior people, but if you trust the function leads to manage their specific function, they're the ones capable of making those micro decisions. And you just have to have trust that the head of tax and the head of HR and the head of product knows what they need that the company has. Like if a company's organized the right way, they all know what they need.
That's the thing. If you can get that 80% like pragmatic and it's in a system that folks can follow, then trust the system.
Then trust the system. Yeah. You trust the box to play in. And then the 20%'s that unknown. You're always going to have that. And then that's what you talk about. You can focus on fixing those things. And all the other stuff, just, they all know how to do it.
Okay, so let's go loop back to the culture piece, right? Because when I talk to integration folks and you ask them like why integration goes wrong, they're always like, bad culture mismatch. Those deal people screwed this one up.
Yeah,
they just didn't think about the culture and blah, blah, blah.
Exactly.
They blame you, right?
Yep. I'm always wrong. That's the problem with corp dev. I'm always wrong. Evaluation is never right. The process isn't right.
I'm really fascinated by the culture piece because it constantly comes up in this podcast. Even though I didn't ask to make this a culture podcast, it just happens that way. But I've been so intrigued by the schools of thought of like, hey, bad culture fit, walk away from the deal. Hey, bad culture fit, it doesn't matter. You're going to make unique culture anyways. Just do the deal.
Yeah.
It makes financial sense to do the deal. And then there's this, I've seen this new school where it's, we have a very unique, empowering culture, and a part of our strategy is going to be to get their culture to conform to our culture.
Yeah, I don't think that works.
I'm going to send you some podcasts where
I would love to hear it. I really do believe I love that this has turned into a culture conversation because I have a strong opinion around it, and I do believe that you need to have the Constitution to keep your culture. But I also don't believe that culture is binary. I think culture exists in a square where people bounce around known frameworks, and some frameworks are very constrained and very tight. They don't have a lot of autonomy, and some cultures are very wide. And so where you fit as a person, culture's alignment. Culture's alignment between, you and your preferences and ways of doing and the company's ways of doing. That's really what it comes down to. And so that's why I believe it is identifiable through process. And you can ask all the questions around how people work and where they do to kind of figure out if your way of working is the way that they work. And if those things are aligned generally, then you're going to be okay.
I'm gonna get you a couple of podcasts. There's one I did with LCI Industry, so Lippert Company Industries, I think.
Yeah.
And then the other, Barry Waymiller.
Okay.
Both multi-billion large corporations. And love to get your take. It's kind of like the extreme, right? You sort of have this, we're going to acquire this company and just not even do anything with them. Or hey, we're going to really look for culture fit because of the way we're going to plan to integrate them, or we're just going to make new cultures come together. Numbers make sense versus culture is our strategy. We're going to change this company's culture strategically to be like ours. I want to send you. I'd love to get your thoughts on.
I would love to, because I think the change of the culture is tough, and it's because I probably am different from most. I have a little bit more of a philosophy background, and I don't think people change. I think people are who they are, and they love culture. Their culture fit And if they're not going to change. The change would be that they would leave the business, right? Because
I know. I think that was part of what we talked about.
Yeah.
I'm going to get you those 2 interviews. The Barry Wimler, that one's coming up pretty recent. And then I've done a couple with Jason Lippert over at LCI. Both of them are like that. Very proactive view of using culture as the part of the strategy.
I'm probably more on the end of if it's not going to be a fit and it's identifiable, we don't do the deal. Example of this I would tell you is we had a meeting a couple months ago where we were looking at the company and the incoming CEO needed to be the leader of this function. He needed to be the person who was going to take control of it and run it. And he just, he was an eccentric, which is great. He was actually a great person, wonderful, but he was a little bit of a bouncing ball and he didn't quite fit the culture and he didn't quite mesh with someone who we needed for that function. And it wasn't that he was a bad employee or a bad person. He was extremely successful, extremely intelligent, but he wasn't going to fit. And we decided, hey, you know what? We're going to go a different direction. And we were okay with that because we would rather have, even though the technology was great and it could have been additive to our company, the culture wouldn't have allowed those synergies to manifest. It just wouldn't have let that M&A deal work.
So you can see that friction. And the other variable too is like the industries, because I feel like they're very different in tech, especially. Like it's just, you're right. There's an expectation of what you're actually going to change versus what you're going to live with.
Yeah, culture change is again, I think that to me, the ability to say, hey, we're going to go in and change that culture of that acquired entity, I think that is over rationalizing. When we talked about that before, I don't know if that's very hard to do.
Anything you do particularly to set up the sort of win-win? I liked how you referenced that it's just as much change for your organization. Is there things that you sort of help with readiness or just anything in specific to make some great outcomes besides using Deal Room?
But I mean, it's advanced training. I do everything in advance. I don't wait. And I know a lot of people say, well, every deal is different. And so we can't do anything until we know about this specific deal. And I don't believe in that at all. I believe that deals are roughly 80% the same and that you can standardize most of that and you can set up your box of preference. One time I was talking about negotiating and they talked about mins and maxes and they said, well, if you change your min, then that isn't really min, your new min. Your min obviously wasn't that. You have a new min. You have to have the constitution to stick to what your principles are and know how to fix them and believe in them. And that becomes what you train people around, that standardization. And then everyone is on the same page and aligned and they kind of know what to expect. And that fear goes away because a lot of people and companies don't have as much M&A experience. They're coming in and they've maybe haven't been a part of it. And so there's a lot of fear of the unknown. And so if you over communicate and you standardize and you give them context and teaching, then they get more comfortable with the process because they know what to expect when it actually happens. And that's, I think, to me, is the biggest key about doing this successfully across a couple different PE-backed portcos is that advanced training. Do as much as you can upfront, knowing that it's going to probably change. But if they don't know what, if you don't know what the barrier is, the foundation is, or success or good looks like, how are you ever going to know what to diligence? How are you ever going to know what a problem is? You're never going to know. So we as corp dev people, we have to set the table for what good looks like, for what the process looks like. And then when we do make changes, we explain why that happened.
So here's a process. Here's how we're going to report out findings. Here's kind of expectation for you to approach diligencing and surfacing those findings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
this is how we're going to get together and discuss and address those things. And
yep, you're just laying out the whole entire thing. But you're giving that process a little bit of flexibility. You're not saying this is binary. You're not saying that we're not going to change. We're just saying this is what we would prefer to do. This is what good looks like to us. And then we will augment it based on what we know. But that augmentation then becomes known and communicated and understood as opposed to being seen as ad hoc if you never had a standard process in the first place.
What's the hardest part of M&A?
Oh, the hardest part of M&A is getting everyone to agree. You heard me joke, I'm always wrong. There's so many opinions and there's so many preferences and there's so many stakeholders that if you do it right, I mean, a lot of people sometimes say, well, I can buy something for the company with a couple people, but I don't believe in that. I believe you have to have the collective buy-in of the right people. That is also harder because you've got to get, instead of 4 or 5 people to agree, I've got to get maybe 15, 20 people to think that that's a good idea.
That's a whole conversation for us to have because there is that, hey, are you just the CEO decides to do the deal or do you actually get the right stakeholders and committee to have consensus, which is technically the right way to do it, but much harder. Just like you said,
it's harder.
And you see the range, like it can, like.
But here's the thing: when you get those 15, 20, whatever people, the right stakeholders in, and you've got a company that's the right company, it's easy. It works. Synergies just fall out, and it's not even hard. So it becomes so much faster when you have that right company. And then everyone says, "Well, Matt, there's no right company. There's no perfect." I'm not talking about binary for the box of good. That box of good has its widget room. It's got its wiggle room, right? But everyone knows and is aligned and agrees. And then when something falls inside the box, it just goes. It's easy.
It's like the golden rule for doing M&As, have stakeholder alignment.
Yeah, 100%. Got to. Because you have one dissenting person, just like, go back to my sports background. You got one bad egg in a clubhouse can infect the entire clubhouse. You got one dissenting stakeholder and you
just know who for identifying them early.
Yep.
What's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
Oh, well, as much as I have stories from my sports days about athletes doing dumb things or crazy things, I have more stories now about entrepreneurs and founders and CEOs and all kinds of stuff. It's probably what makes the job the most fun is the people you get to meet along the way. I mean, there's just endless amounts of conversation with great, smart people. How companies came to be is a favorite topic of mine of how this company became to be. So I've seen a lot of different things. I think the craziest thing I saw was a company years and years ago when I was a banker. And the guy who started the company was from Belarus and didn't like communism. And we figured out through some diligence that he had been adjusting some expense lines using a management estimate of inventory value to reduce his taxes, which is obviously not good. And the answer he gave me was, well, I don't want to pay Mother Russia a dime more than I have to. And we all laughed because, he didn't live in Russia anymore. But at the same time, he was so impacted by that upbringing that he had effectively adjusted his taxes to not have to pay because of that experience. And it was interesting to see him do that. We couldn't sell the company, unfortunately, because of that. I had to do a lot of work to right-size the business, but it was one of the more entertaining things I've seen along the way.
It's crazy. Yeah. Crazy stuff like that happens all the time.
Happens all the time.
Matt, thank you so much for taking the time. You helped me understand a lot about just this process, getting the right people involved, really what buyer-led means in contrast to a banker-led process. Thanks for helping me become a better M&A scientist.
Yeah, fun conversation. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
If you've listened this far, family, my fellow M&A science brother, sister, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I always welcome the feedback from these podcasts, topic ideas, and criticism. I do actually get some criticism now that I've been asking for it on this
it's always
sign off here. It is, actually it is. I sometimes get a little defensive, but after you soak it in, honestly, it's helped shape even our lineup, some of the approaches I do and things I should and shouldn't ask. So I'll take it. Sometimes I'll deflect on it, but most of the time I welcome the criticism. Till next time, here's to the deal.